record so we don't forget. And we have some attendees.
Cool.
Excellent. We'll give folks a minute.
So this means that they see us, but we don't see them, right?
You can't see or
Hello,
hear
people
anyone
who we
live,
cannot see.
but you can joyously welcome them.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
Hello, hello, hello.
Say hello in the chat, share where you're from. We'll start in a few minutes as we give people a time or two to kind of get in the room.
I'm so accustomed to playing Hollywood squares, but today we are tic-tac-toeing. I don't know what this four square, I don't know. I gotta stop.
Four squares.
Before I send people away with my incessant rambling. Welcome, everybody.
Yes. Welcome, welcome. Feel free to share your name and where you're joining us from in the chat if you would like. I know we have lots of folks from different places. If you want to share your role, if you're a teacher, if you're a university student or researcher.
And call out your writing projects. So excited. Writing projects.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Very true. So we'll get started in just a few minutes.
We're very fond of like shameless self-promotion in our writing projects. So as folks are settling in, you're going to hear me talk about this a couple of times tonight, but we want to let you know that our podcast, Teaching Writers Speak, just landed in the world today. And our guest today, Nicole, is going to be a future guest on that podcast. So it lives on Spotify right now, but it's gonna make its way to all of your usual podcast platforms. And we'd love for you to check it out. And I'm going to do that thing that all podcasters do, which is like, subscribe, rate us, go to Apple and tell us how wonderful we are, even if you don't like us. We'd love to hear from you.
And folks who are big fans of Ty Wachlin's voice will be very excited to know the podcast contains a lot of his voice. Is that correct?
It does. Although thankfully, folks who are less fond of my rambling, luckily the floor is open for other people. So I do ask a couple of questions, but I try to step out of the way, which I'm not always so good at, but that's what this mute button I think is really handy for. So please mute me up as necessary.
Excellent, great. For folks who are just joining us, we're going to get started in a few minutes. While you wait, if you don't mind putting into the chat your name and where you're joining us from, as well as if you want to share your role that you're in, if you're a professor, if you're a pre-service teacher, if you're someone who's currently a teacher. And then as Nicole mentioned, if you'd like to include your writing project that you've been a part of in the past or currently, that would be really great as well.
Hi, Susan Lytle. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Talk about writing projects, like
right?
Legends. Really exciting.
We have writing project luminaries in the
Mm.
house tonight.
Definitely. Very true. So maybe just a minute more. And Ty, do you want to also share the information for folks who might want to engage with us on our listserv?
I absolutely will do that. I'll probably try to do that a couple of times as well. As soon as I find my little handy dandy link.
So Ty will be sharing this, and if you want to join in some of the other activities and events that we have with the Toronto Writing Project now and into the future, please make sure that you sign up. Fingers crossed, we'll get to continue doing TWP Speaks in the future, perhaps face-to-face, as well as the different, it's a creative writing group, is that true? Did I make that up?
Yes, we have writing workshops that run on a monthly basis. We have 2 in-house poets who run these incredible workshops. They're open to anybody who wants to come and hang out on the Zoom room to do that. We have our speaker series, which you're all coming and enjoying us tonight. We have a podcast. Did I mention we have a podcast? We have, and I think hopefully once we can, now that the world is sort of opening gently, we might be looking ahead to some other engagements in next year. So stay tuned.
Excellent. Susan Lytle already gave you a big wow for the podcast. The only person to maybe listen more quickly than your mom, Ty.
I was going to say, Julie Wachlin was definitely the first listener, but yes. Thank you, Susan. That means a lot.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. For folks, if this is your first time joining us, this is the TWP Speaks speaker series. And we're really excited to round out the final talk of the year, having had Elizabeth Dutro in the fall, Antero, Garcia in January. And I'm very excited to share with you today that we have Nicole Mirra, who is a brilliant mind, joining us from New York, where she is a professor at Rutgers University. And we are very excited to have you all here. So for the format tonight, we'll go ahead. I'm going to turn it over to Ty, who will do a land acknowledgement and an introduction. And then from there, we'll turn it over to Nicole. We do have the chat open at present, but we also have a Q&A box that you can access through the webinar. So you can feel free to post your questions there, and we'll take those at the end and have Nicole address those for you as well. And we are recording our conversation tonight so that it can be part of the podcast and hopefully archived on our website. So for now, I'll turn it over to Ty.
Thanks, Cassie. So hi, folks. I'm Ty Walkland. I'm a doctoral candidate here at U of T. You've already heard me flapping my lips enough. Did I mention I'm also a podcast host of Toronto Writing Project's new podcast that just came out today? We know that all of you are tuning in from different places in the world, but we feel it's important that we want to acknowledge that the land that we are operating on today, the land which the University of Toronto operates, that for thousands of years it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're so grateful as always to have the opportunity to work on this land and to invite you to share in that with us tonight. And as you heard, Nicole Mirra is our guest tonight. And Nicole Mirra is an assistant professor of urban teacher education in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers State University of New Jersey. Previously, Nicole taught high school English language arts in Brooklyn, in New York, and Los Angeles. Her research explores the intersections of critical literacy and civic engagement with youth and teachers across classroom, community, and digital learning environments. Central to her research and teaching agenda is a commitment to honoring and amplifying the literacy practices and linguistic resources that students from minoritized communities bring to public life and articulating a speculative paradigm for civic education. She is the author of Educating for Empathy, Literacy, Learning, and Civic Engagement. We know some of you folks in the room tonight have been engaging with that wonderful book. And she's also co-author with Antero, Garcia, and Ernest Morrell of Doing Youth Participatory Action Research, Transforming Inquiry with Researchers, Educators, and Students. And we're super fortunate to have you with us tonight, Nicole. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Rob. Thanks everybody for spending a weeknight, a school night with me. I know this has been in the works for quite a while. I remember Cassie and I discussing this. I was planning to come to Toronto in person way back. I think it would have been the spring of 2020 when everything started happening. So I hope to get up there in person again soon, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share with all of you. So I love the chat. So please keep the energy going in the chat. I'm going to have some questions throughout the talk that I'd love to hear your thoughts about. But let me just make sure that everyone can I get somebody to let me know for sure that you can see my screen?
You can see it right now if you want to go to your presenter view.
Awesome.
And it looks great.
Alrighty. All right. So I am very excited to talk to you a little bit today about some of my work and how it might relate to some of the work that you all are doing in schools. So the title I'm using for today is Literacy Learning for New Social Futures, the Purpose and Practice of Critical Civic Empathy. And I'm really excited to learn that some folks have been reading Educating for Empathy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how my ideas about that have been changing. The world is changing so fast. That book came out in 2018, which means that I finished writing it in 2017 and submitted it to the publisher, which was the first year of the Trump administration. And to think about how the world in our country, where I'm coming from, the US context, has changed since then is pretty dizzying. And I also appreciate Ty giving land acknowledgement. And I also wanted to, in the land of Zoom, we're all coming from different places. So I did want to mention that I'm currently coming to you as an uninvited guest on the land of the Lenape people. And I think I've thought a lot about why land acknowledgements are so important. And you may have thought to yourself, why do we do these? And I think that obviously the most important reason is to recognize the indigenous communities on whose land we live, to honor them and to remember how that came to be. But for me, I've been thinking more recently about why it matters in the work that we do as educators and the work that I do as a researcher. And I think that for me, it's important to make these acknowledgements and remember that the social arrangements that we are currently living within in Canada, in the United States, wherever you're joining us from, have not always been this way and may not always be this way. So for me, it's a way to decenter the fact that the social arrangements we see, the borders we see around us, the systems we live within are not taken for granted, are not a given, and that they can change and they will change over time. So it helps me to think about the past, the present, and the future. And as educators, we're thinking about our students right now in our classroom, and we're thinking about the future that they're going to inherit. And I have to say, I've been thinking about the future a lot lately. And if you're like me, there's a lot going on when I think about the future right now that concerns me, and that concerns me for the young people that are sitting in our classrooms right now. Everything from, and these are all headlines just from the past few months. So everything from climate change, obviously, the literal threat of the end of democratic governments, the ongoing pandemic, war in the Ukraine and the atrocities that are happening there. And our young people are coming to class each day and are sitting in our classrooms. And I wonder what they think about their future. And I'm going to share some of what I've learned from the young people I've been working with. And I wonder about our responsibility. I wonder about what it means to prepare young people for a world that we cannot yet imagine, in what could be obviously very distressing ways, but also hopefully in ways of great possibility and potential. So I'm not here to bum us all out, but I am here to talk about the urgent stakes of this moment and why I think it's so important that this moment demands that we do not just, as many folks have tried to do as we've come back into in-person learning through the pandemic, get back to some kind of quote unquote new normal. I think that's a really dangerous way to think because of the fact that the way things we were doing things before the pandemic obviously weren't working for many of the young people in our lives and are continuing to not work, and that we need to do something a little different. And so as I thought about the future, and this actually again goes back to right before the pandemic shut things down, I was fortunate enough to go to the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I live here in Brooklyn, New York, and I listened to two amazing Afrofuturist speculative fiction authors speak to each other at BAM, N.K. Jemisin and Ijeoma Oluo, and they actually recorded that talk. And I just want to play for you the first 1 minute of this clip because I literally think about this clip maybe like once a week as I think about our work as educators. And she's here speaking about what it means to create in a racially unjust world and how she thinks about the future.
I've always felt that activism is a very creative practice. And where we fail and where we're most threatened is the limits of our imagination. And especially, I think, for racial activism in a white supremacist world, our imagination is so boxed in by white supremacy that our definition of freedom is even boxed in by white supremacy. And what I'm constantly worrying and fighting against is the limitations, and sometimes it's generational and sometimes it's not, of what we can imagine in the future. And it's so revelationary to me to see this just imagination, vast imagination of the past and the future, and actually to see some of this story play out of like, these are my limitations. Because I'm constantly telling people, like, I don't know what freedom looks like. And my grandkids one day are gonna say, why didn't you see this? Why did you stop us here when we could have done more?
So obviously I encourage you to find more of this clip to hear more of the brilliance that happened, but I literally think once a week about this talk, and I think about the question that Ijeoma Oluo posed. I know that I don't know what freedom looks like. And I encourage you in the chat to think about this idea of what you imagine freedom might look like. The idea that she states there that we are so, our schemas, our brains, our frameworks are so shaped by the world in which we've currently lived, the structures that we currently live, the institutions we currently live within, that when we try to think of what a world of freedom looks like, we often are still boxed in by those structures, including structures of racial oppression and white supremacy. And so what does it mean to teach toward a world that does not yet exist? Thinking about all the rough things that are going on in our world right now that I just mentioned and from those headlines, when I think about the young people sitting in our classrooms, I think about, does it make sense for us to be educating them to fit into civic institutions, academic institutions that we know are broken? And you know, that phrase, what is it? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So to me, I've been thinking a lot about why should young people buy into or be excited about a future that we are leaving to them that is so dysfunctional in so many ways. And at the same time, how do we teach toward a future when we can't really even imagine outside of what we've been taught? And so I've just been kind of wrestling with this idea in my work, in my teaching, of what responsibility we have and how we could start to learn to teach toward a future that we cannot even yet imagine. And I find that really exciting. And I find it as a way to kind of push past a lot of the fear and despair that can sometimes seek to creep in. We know that this has been a really rough school year for everyone that works in schools. If you work with young people, folks thought that obviously the pandemic, the lockdown years were pretty hard, but I know that every educator I know feels like this school year has been the hardest of their lives for young people and for us. And I think we need something to reach toward. And one thing that in my work over the years that I keep on coming back to is this idea of empathy. So as you are thinking and putting in the chat how you think about freedom, I know when I think about freedom, even if I don't know what it looks like, I believe that empathy has to be a huge part of it. This idea of being able to imaginatively step out of our own frames of reference and step into and appreciate and be in solidarity with the perspectives of others who differ from us. I see that as a huge step forward. And I think that it's been interesting to me that over the past 5 years that I've been thinking about this term, it's become a lot more popular in our discourse, educational discourse. It's become a little bit of a buzzword. And as that's happened, I'm excited to see the awareness raising about empathy and resilience and the social emotional learning of our young people. But I also worry that as it becomes more popular, it's getting a little bit, its meaning is getting a little bit dampened. It's getting a little simplified, and it's getting used in ways that rob it of its potential to be revolutionary and to be transformative. And it's kind of getting sucked into the grammar of schooling in ways that I want us to fight against. So I want to talk a little bit about empathy and why I think it's important, but also why I worry about how it's being used in much of social emotional learning in our classes today. And so I think about it in terms of several myths about empathy. I feel like as we see, I know it's not the same maybe in Canada, although I don't know the context as well. So you can let me know if there's any critical race theory propaganda being spread in your school districts. But obviously here in the United States, many states are dealing with pushback on the idea of racial literacies, pushback on talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. And in a lot of those places, social emotional learning is seen as kind of like the happy alternative because it is seen as somehow apolitical. Let's not talk about the thorny issues of race and oppression. Let's talk about empathy, and let's talk about how we should all be one big happy human family, and that'll make things a little bit better. And I worry about that because, again, we know that empathy in the real world is not apolitical. It is just like every other human construct, influenced by social constructs, and can lead toward prejudicial and oppressive thinking. I almost, like in a moment of like very dark humor, I kind of like snorted when I first saw like this headline, because this is just such like an understatement of how Europe welcomes Ukrainian refugees, but others less so. And I just almost had to laugh at how like tone deaf that headline seemed. You may be hearing stories about in Ukraine right now, folks who are African, folks who are Black are having a harder time when they're moving across borders trying to get services. So we know that empathy oftentimes is constrained by the imaginations of the people who are seeking to embody it. So if we have certain forms of prejudice in our lives, we often then replicate that form of prejudice when we are trying to enact empathy. We tend to empathize easier with folks that either look like us, think like us, live like us, and it's very hard sometimes to empathize across lines of difference, which is what the entire point was supposed to be in the first place. It also speaks to how difficult empathy can be in practice. And also the role of the media, this is the headlines that I've been showing you. The media plays a large role in empathy. And oftentimes our empathy is being shaped by media, just like our ideas about what's going on around the world. We often hear about misinformation, disinformation. Oftentimes our empathy, who we are being asked to empathize with, is not neutral. It is politicized. And I was thinking a lot about this is from obviously 2020. This is the police report or the police media report that was put out, and it's about the death of George Floyd. And I'm struck by the fact that, if we, again, police departments in the United States are often informing newspapers about how they report upon stories, and oftentimes, again, shaping the empathy of the public, raising their awareness about certain issues and dampening it about other issues. If this was the only report that came out, if a young person, 17-year-old Darnella Frazier, did not have her cell phone on her and did not record the murder of George Floyd, then this is the only telling of that incident that many of us may have seen. So who is our empathy shaped towards and who is it shaped against leads to a much deeper exploration of the political nature of empathy, and leads us into tough conversations about the intersection of empathy and things like oppression and continuing injustice. So that's one thing I worry about, is when we talk about empathy, but we don't talk about this part of it, and we just kind of paper over that. Another thing I worry about, again, and kind of related to that first point, is that empathy is warm and fuzzy. Like, isn't it so great to realize that we all are in common, we all share things in common, and it is. Connection is beautiful, and that's why I believe empathy is hopeful. It's why I believe it's one of the keys to a future that we strive for of justice and equity. But empathy is not simply, especially for folks from minoritized communities who have to have empathy every day when they walk out the door, to be wondering what other folks are thinking about them so they can navigate public space. That is not a warm and fuzzy thing. Empathy is often about calculated survival, trying to figure out how the people who are going to influence your political life, your educational life, are moving in the world so that you can figure out how to move and survive as well. Ta-Nehisi Coates, famous author, many of us may have read his memoir, Between the World and Me, which was written as a series of letters to his son. And as a Black man in America writing to his son, he tells him, "I would not have you descend into your own dream. I would have you be a conscious citizen of this terrible and beautiful world." And I think that empathy, as I see it, is not about necessarily just thinking about the warm and fuzzy nature of finding commonality, but also about a true reckoning with this terrible and beautiful world that we live within. To have true empathy is to think seriously about our positionality, and to think about the positionality of others, and the kind of world that we have created, and what it would mean to struggle together towards something different. And finally, this idea that empathy is justice is something that I worry about. This idea that if we just empathize, we've done our job and we can be happy that we were part of, we did it. And this idea that, especially in schools, that's all we need to ask of young people, is just to see another perspective and be nice, and that we've done our jobs. But there's a famous quote we might have heard before from Lilla Watson: "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together." And to me, if empathy does not do much more than to make us feel good, if it doesn't change the way we act in community with our neighbors, if it doesn't change the way we vote, if it doesn't change the way we speak up when we see injustices around us, then empathy isn't worth that much, right? And so that's why I worry about forms of socio-emotional learning that are surface level, because in the end, it winds up pretty much just kind of making everyone feel good, but not really doing anything to challenge any of the entrenched social inequities that we see around us. And therefore, it just perpetuates systems of white supremacy and oppression. So social emotional learning, this is a graphic that here in the United States, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, this is a graphic that a lot of their materials have, and it is used in a lot of school districts around the country. And empathy is part of their model that fits into one of these categories. And when I go to their website and I think to myself, well, what is the rationale? Why are we doing this in schools? Are we integrating this because we care about coming out of COVID, with talking about young people's resilience, talking about their mental health challenges, talking about what it means to live together in a reimagined world, think about democracy and how to make decisions together? And what I often find in the research base is that it's not about that. It's really more about academic achievement within the status quo. So performing well on tests. The rationale is that if we get students to learn about their emotional lives, they will be able to regulate themselves, so they will sit in our classrooms and do the work that we've asked them to do, take the tests we've asked them to take, obey and move obediently through our school system. which in the end of the day is not, again, what it means to be a democratic citizen. We don't always need to just be nice. Sometimes we need to step up, stand out, and say something. And sometimes that's not seen as something that we want to promote in schools, unfortunately, by some of the folks that are putting these different programs into action. So when I put all this together in the book, I thought about this idea of what I call critical civic empathy. So I try to add those two qualifiers to empathy because I still believe that it's important, but I believe that, again, empathy can be weaponized if we're not careful. So I do believe that, again, these two axes here are this idea of mutual humanization. Do we truly believe that we are not fully human and fully free until others are free? And social and political action. Do we believe that we need to be engaged in democratic life together? And there are obviously, and I think that obviously this graphic doesn't refer to like individual people. This is just a thought exercise. I think we're all moving between these different quadrants maybe all the time. But I do feel like in the news, we hear a lot about, right now especially, instances of hate and instances of imaginative refusal, folks that don't seem very interested in seeing others' full humanity and don't seem very interested in the project of democracy and reimagining the world toward equity. And they get a lot of airtime, but I'm hoping that maybe it's not obviously very many people. I think it's a minority that's very loud. But I also think that in our political discourse, especially, we do have a lot of folks that know how to use the language of empathy, but again, weaponize it and aren't truly interested in everyone's freedom. They're only interested in empathizing with folks, again, who share their own political perspectives, identities, things like that. And I call that false empathy, this idea of speaking to an us in a country, but that us might only refer to people who vote like them or look like them. And again, that becomes a very dangerous form of empathy. And I think over here, obviously, there's this idea of folks that truly want to be in community with others, care about humanization, but just aren't quite sure what it means to get socially and politically engaged, especially in the classroom, when it can seem like a very fraught time. Politics can seem very rancorous, it can seem dangerous to talk about democracy and to talk about social issues that might divide us. So I think critical civic empathy for me is a way to argue for the idea that we need to be talking about power and privilege. We need to be talking about, again, this idea of commitments to anti-racism and abolition of our current systems. We need to talk about the hard and soul-searching work that it takes to move outside of our identity categories and into the world of another person is not a simple thing. It is not simply putting on, slipping on another person's pair of shoes. That is not what critical civic empathy takes. It's much deeper than that. And that it requires solidarity and action to become meaningful. And so as I thought about empathy, especially as the Trump administration moved on, and as we moved into the pandemic, I worked a lot, again, with our previous guest that you had here, Antero Garcia, a colleague and friend. And the two of us thought a lot about his work around trauma and healing, and my work around critical civic empathy. And the two of us really thought about this idea of the speculative. So hearkening back to the authors that you heard from at the beginning of my talk, N.K. Jemisin, other authors who play with the idea of futures that are not fantasy. They are actually futures that are like acknowledging the deep social issues that are going on in our time, and purposely, as a political act, imagine futures in which those oppressions here in our current moment are disrupted or are suddenly absent, suddenly have been taken away. And I think the idea of the speculative, the idea of imagining what that freedom might look like that we talked about, the freedom outside of oppression and white supremacy. I started to wonder with Antero, what would it mean to think about students' literacies that are oriented toward a civic world in the future that is not simply preparing them for the democracy that we currently live within. We're not simply teaching them how to integrate into the structures that currently exist. We are working with them to figure out how to learn to build new structures, and what kind of learning would that take? And so that's kind of the big 20,000 foot idea about where I've kind of been going with the idea of empathy since the book came out over the past several years. And very briefly, and then I want to show you what this looks like on the ground, because I think that the big ideas are important, but I also want to show you a project that I've been working on that tries to take this into classrooms with high school and middle school young people. But first, just briefly, this idea of the speculative. what would it mean to, again, not prioritize the state when we talk about civics? When we talk about literacy, what it would mean to talk about everyday civic relationships between young people, so that we can build the kind of institutions that we want, instead of just using those institutions to constrain our imaginations. What would it mean to be talking about a spirit of collaborative practice and mutual humanization together through literacy, which again, in the United States, civic education is often seen as the domain of social studies teachers. And it's often seen as a kind of collection of facts about how the government works. It's very focused on institutional activities like voting. And I'm not sure, I'm curious to know more about the Canadian context of civics as well. But I'm interested in moving away from the institutions and structures and thinking more about what it means to seek joy, admit injustice, and dream of a civic otherwise together. And so I took this idea, the streaming, and of course I'm a writing project lifer. So I knew that I wanted to do a project that involved writing project sites. So over the past several years, I've been involved in a project called something I designed called the Digital Democratic Dialogue, or 3D project. And that project involves high school teachers from across the United States. We have teachers from Alaska, rural Northern California, outside of Denver, Colorado, outside of Dallas, Texas, outside of Detroit, Michigan, and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So it wasn't meant to be representative in any way. It was just meant to be, what would it mean if a bunch of high school teachers, English teachers, who were part of the National Writing Project Network, who are interested in this idea of literacy for democracy, literacy to imagine a better future, what would it mean if we got together and used the affordances of digital media to connect our students across time and space, to talk about what mattered to them, what kind of civic present they saw, what kind of civic future they saw. And so obviously it was exciting because we did have lots of different kinds of communities. It just so happened that this was meant to be kind of an experiment. We happened to have communities that leaned ideologically towards different ends of the spectrum, lots of different types of racial backgrounds, ideology, all kinds of different backgrounds, gender backgrounds. So it was interesting to bring together all these groups. And this was happening during the school day, and that was important to us as well. So we know there's all kinds of amazing work, and I've done work in YPAR and other kinds of activities that take place outside of the school day because there's so much freedom to work in community spaces. But it was really important to us to think about where this could fit into the regular constraints that we all face during the school day. So these were English teachers who were integrating this project into the curriculum of their normal grade level English classes. And so we were trying to figure out what would it mean to design together and still fit into all the curriculum they had to do in their own districts, the testing they had to do, all the things that come with being a full-time teacher. And so what we did was we got together as a group, these teachers, and we, in the summer before the school year began, and we said, all right, let's design 3 cycles, and every teacher could take these cycles in different ways, because we know that everyone has their own constraints in their schools. We can't just all do like a 6-week unit. That's not how we think. We want this to be something that imbues all of our practice. So we thought about it in terms of design. So we spent kind of the fall, the winter, and the spring moving iteratively and kind of spiraling through 3 design cycles that we used to take these abstract principles that I just talked about and bring them into reality. So this idea of the everyday that I talked about speculative, we turned this into a question for young people. So our first design cycle question that started the school year for young people was, who are we as individuals and how are we connected in community? And we wanted to pose that to the students that lived in these 6 different communities across the United States, so they could start to see that would be defined in very different ways. Even though we all live within this, boundaries of this nation state, we could actually forget about that for a moment and let's start from the bottom up instead of the top down. We already talked earlier about some of those headlines. I get very frustrated as someone who cares about civic literacy learning, is that young people are living the consequences of our civic decisions every day. They are civic actors sitting in our classrooms that have opinions and views about every major issue going on around us. And yet we continue to treat them in a lot of our education and a lot of our political discourse as if they are, at best, citizens in training, and at worst, just kind of disengaged, narcissistic, and ignorant young people who don't know what's going on in public life and are on social media. And I get very frustrated about that interpretation of young people, and they do too. So when we talked to students, one of our students in Philadelphia talked about how adults tend to view young people. And she talked about how at her job, one of the state representatives came and he brought all this stuff to give out to people. And then we talked to him afterwards and he was like, yeah, well, thank you guys for helping. And we were like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And he was like, just tell your parents to vote for me. And we heard this over and over again across all 6 of our sites, all different types of communities. It was like 95% of our students in the project felt like adults did not value the opinions of young people like them. And they internalized that and often thought, I'm not interested in civics because I'm being told that obviously I'm not part of this community. I'm being told that my opinion isn't valid until I turn 18 or I can participate in ways that are valued by the institutions. So we decided to flip that and kind of think a little bit about what are the communities that matter to young people. And obviously some of these communities, these are young people. This makes sense developmentally: family, the place that they're living, friends, school, faith. And then, but what was key to us is that we decided to have them introduce each other through photo essays. And when they introduced themselves to each other on a social network, we found that those issues of race and gender and political ideas were kind of creeping into the communities of family and place and the different things like that. So they shared all kinds of pictures with each other. And one of the issues that came up a lot during our year together that I'll talk more about in a moment is the issue of guns, which in the United States, unfortunately, we obviously are kind of an outlier with how incredibly bad our problems with gun violence are. And so it's not surprising that when young people got together to share their lives, gun violence in communities were kind of floating around the surface and the edges of their dialogue. But one of our students actually posted a picture of how her family in Alaska would go hunting for food. So using guns in a totally different context. And it was just fascinating to watch young people living in different parts of this country learn about the activities of others that could seem so outside of their frame of reference. And a student commented on another student's story about hunting in Alaska and said, your story and your situation is very different than anything I ever hear. And the first student responded, and it said, and he went on to say that like guns, it was very strange. The guns did not play that role in his life of being able to be used as a tool for food. And he was kind of surprised by that. And the first student said, I'm not insulted at all by your stance. You live in a completely different area. So by no means should I be offended and not listen to other stances. And there was a little bit of a veil kind of coming down just for a moment of that kind of the real kind of critical civic empathy that we were searching for, of young people thinking, oh, like, this isn't just somebody who's living differently than me, but we both live in the same political structure. What does it mean to kind of build together when we have these very different experiences? How do we come together politically around certain ideas? And so this made us think about, what needs to be decentered in our teaching. So do we often expand our curriculum enough to allow our young people to, again, move outside their frame of reference in a stance of curiosity and a stance of compassion and a stance of care? And even better if it's with real people. Like, I'm an English teacher, so I also believe in the power of obviously literature to create empathy, for us to see stories outside our own. But there's something so powerful about young people meeting, even through digital means, other actual teenagers living around the country and around the world that have experiences for them to learn from. And so I'm gonna just kind of rush through these final slides because I want to make sure I stop in about 5 minutes for us to have some dialogue. So please, anything that you've been thinking about, I want to get to dialogue in just a moment. But very briefly, the second design cycle we moved into was about like taking that kind of big community feeling and then moving into, let's talk about social issues now. Instead of just coming into a classroom and saying, we're going to talk about the current events of the day, we first wanted students to actually connect, think about themselves in community, and then we start to introduce the issues they care about. And again, like I said, guns became an issue that the most popular issue that students wanted to discuss across their smaller groups. And we put students into cross-school groups for them to discuss. And what's really interesting is that this gets to that idea of not being able to imagine outside of our own frames. Students have been so trained that when they get into a group to talk about a current event, that it has to be a debate, that even though we tried to set up our groups with students to be more about exploration and storytelling, students, when they first got into their groups, immediately literally said, hello, I will be joining you in this debate, because no one told them to do that, but that's literally how we see on cable news, in our discourse. It has to be confrontational. And we keep teaching young people to make arguments. And I have a whole nother, I can go on a whole nother rant about argument writing and how we press that to the point where students are simply throwing evidence at each other and they're not quite sure why or how to come to any kind of consensus. So young people started like sharing quotes that they had found from the internet, and dialogue kept on dying because, as you know, if you're on social media, if you start to just throw facts back and forth or claims back and forth, it's very easy to just shut down because there seems like there's no way forward that's productive. So we kind of retooled our expectations. We talked to young people about what we were seeing. We had them examine their dialogue. And then we asked them to maybe instead talk about what the issue of guns meant in their lives. And so again, students started sharing photo essays with each other. And so in one of the small groups, a student from California that had a positive relationship with guns shared a picture. And a student from Philadelphia showed a picture that was a very different experience of guns and talked about a tribute on the street to someone who had been lost to gun violence. And again, in a different context where connections hadn't been made, this could just be another back and forth. But because of the kind of relationships that had been built, and because these were young people speaking to other real young people across the country, this really became a moment of learning for them. Again, this moment of critical civic empathy for them to say like, oh, your experience is something that I have never, like, maybe I would think differently about these issues if I had this kind of experience. So students said it's kind of surreal because it's kind of like, hey, there are people out there outside of you, and there are people that exist and have lives and have experiences that aren't you. And that's kind of weird to think about because our life is us. It's always what we've experienced and what we've known. And rarely do people get to go out and experience other people's lives. So seeing these other people and reading about the experiences they've had, it's really eye-opening. And I feel like that's a teenager's vision of exactly, that's like the goal of what we had for the entire project. And I don't want to make it seem like we had this like magical space that kept on, like all these connections were just like, my whole like political life was changed. It wasn't. These were very like brief moments that would appear and then kind of fade because we're still working with what does it mean to sustain this kind of thinking in a school system in which we move on to the next thing, in which that's not the kind of thinking that's being encouraged across our schools, across our educational system. So we'll think about these almost moments, and I'll just say briefly, because I don't want to go too far into it, but there was tragedy that also occurred related to guns. So it reminded us again of this kind of the one step forward, two steps back nature of trying to work in solidarity and empathy with each other, that as students were having conversations about guns in school, there were students literally experiencing gun violence in their lives. And during the school year, schools were actually shut down in an entire community because of the fear of someone coming to the community with a gun. So literally it was kind of seeing what it means to dream amid injustice and to dream amid despair kind of kept on happening. But what we kept coming back to is the idea that we have to act as if it was, as Angela Davis tells us, act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and we have to do it all the time. And so this community became a space of healing for us. Our teachers came together from the writing project after the school year was over, and we kind of mapped out the entire year and all the events that were going on in the world, in their communities, in their schools, how it was influencing the dialogue young people were having, and what that could do to change the literacy curriculum, what that could do if this was an approach we took to civics instead of the kind of by the book approach. And we also took some time at the end of the school year to have some fun. We imagined superheroes, civic superheroes that could solve problems. So students, this is a student from Michigan who dreamed of a superhero named Homegirl, who has the power to create homes and end homelessness. And young people didn't do this just as a way to escape. In the real spirit of speculative, some people think this might just be like distracting ourselves from what's really going on in the world by using magic or superheroes. But we found that superheroes and magic could be a powerful way to enter a conversation about problems that we wish we could eliminate, and then use that as a conduit into talking about what systems we currently have to address these problems that aren't working, and then to start working towards an otherwise. So I'll just kind of close with kind of this idea of what I want to leave you with is this idea of students, not structures. So as educators, and myself included, we have been socialized by the school systems in which we work and the civic systems in which we live. And so constantly trying to push ourselves again to think of what freedom could look like beyond the bounds of our imaginations. And I think that comes from listening to our students. This idea that every choice we make in the classroom all learning is civics learning. So you don't need to be called a civics educator. You don't need to be teaching a civics class to know that every choice you make is little p political. So that means that not, partisan politics, but every choice we make about our curriculum, about our units, are transmitting messages about values and the kind of world that we hope our young people will inherit. And we can co-design with them and with each other in the Writing Project Network and across, we have digital media, we can do all kinds of things across time and space to work together toward an otherwise. So toward the end of the year, our students kind of reflected on what the year was like for them to be part of the project. And a lot of it was it was startling to think that even at 15, some of the young people in our project were saying like, yeah, this was amazing. I just don't think that I'm going to see change in some of these issues within my lifetime. And the fact that 15-year-olds were already kind of thinking about what could or could not be done within the span of their entire lifetime was, again, another indictment of the kind of society that we're leaving to our young people. But at the same time, when they talk to each other, instead of trusting in just the adults in their lives, they really found a lot of energy and excitement for what could be possible. So they kind of came out with this kind of measured, ambiguous enthusiasm of saying, I hesitate, but I do have hope, is what one student said. And I take that as kind of like a mantra from the project and a kind of call to action for all of us to hesitate with the stakes that we see around us, but to still have hope and to think about how we can change our pedagogies in ways to foster an empathy that kind of, again, works with to imagine a world worthy of the young people in our lives. So thank you so much. And I'm going to stop talking so that we can do some conversation.
Yay. Thank you so much, Nicole. That was really wonderful, as always. Lots of kudos in the chat, and people were making lots of connections to other scholars and even their own teaching sometimes with some of the things that you were sharing. I really was just really struck by the question that you had of what does it mean to dream amidst injustice? And I think that that's like such an important question, as you pointed out in those early slides about some of the things that we're seeing now, that we've been seeing for a while, and thinking about where we're kind of headed. So I'm going to encourage folks to pop questions in the Q&A, or if you want to put them in the chat, we can grab a hold of those. But for now, Ty or Rob, do you have any questions while we wait for folks? Or any?
I just want to first thank you so much, Nicole. This was such an inspiring talk, and I love your work, and I really appreciate your commitment. As a teacher, as someone who's socialized in the field as a teacher, to working and supporting on the ground the lives and life chances of young people, which is so powerful. I was just thinking about this. At the center of your work is this importance of valuing youth perspectives, centering their perspectives in the classroom, their desires and their questions. And I just think how that runs so counter from some of the trends that we see politically. So, for example, I had a news report that popped up on my phone during your talk that 54,000 trans students in the United States are now at risk of losing their health care as a result of GOP laws at the state level. So there is this tension, and I think you highlight this quite well, that we can on the one hand empathize, but on the other hand, we have to work in solidarity and alongside to support some kind of change. So I in our work in addressing injustices, we talk about imagining and working toward the world we want from within the world we have. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts about that, like what that looks and feels like at a classroom level. How do we invite teachers to learn and work alongside students in the ways that you are inviting us to?
Yeah, I love that question, because I know the 3D project is obviously, this is something that was developed like over years and, involved funding from university. It could seem overwhelming, and a classroom teacher could say like, yeah, the 3D project is great, but that's like, I can't do that, right? We all have requirements in our lives, curriculum we're given sometimes. And so I think I like to talk to teachers about the idea of small moves. Small moves are radical acts. So literally it's about just thinking about the units that we teach. So if I'm, when I finished my doctorate, I went back to high school English teaching, and I knew I couldn't teach the same way that I had taught before I started my program, after all the experience I had had with youth participatory action research, the ideas I had learned. But I still was in a charter school network that had very strict, testing schedules and a set curriculum. And so literally just helping teachers to like move out of the idea that we don't teach each unit based on a topic or a book. So I'm not going to teach my To Kill a Mockingbird unit. I'm going to think about what the civic issues are that are embedded in that like every great novel that all of us are teaching is famous or is canonical because of the fact that it is not only about universal human themes, but also about a specific time and place. And we can draw out what is in that civic issue and make that the theme of my unit. And just making that little switch to like, that's a small move that a teacher could make. Or I tell teachers I have a unit planning template where maybe your final assessment is not something that is only going to be turned into you, but maybe we can shift our final assessment to be something that is communicating with the public. We could do a blog series. We could do a community night where other community members are coming. Like that's a more of a civic kind of idea of assessment. So there are tiny little things that we can do. And then once we do those tiny things and start to have success, and we invite our administrators in and we invite community members in so that no one's scared about the idea that we're politicizing instruction or trying to like tell young people how to think, then we might be ready to like find partners in the community and then do a small version, a very small version of the 3D project of getting folks to talk even across schools within a district sometimes. We live in a time of such residential segregation that you don't need to reach across the country to talk to someone that has a different experience. You can sometimes reach across your city, you can reach across your local community. So, and then we have the National Writing Project Network. So I feel like we don't need to be worried about where to find folks who would be willing to engage in this kind of work with us. And that's where I gain a lot of my hope. As I said, I didn't talk about it too much, but the teacher network that has come out of the writing project and of the 3D project for us, we still meet. You know, our work was obviously disrupted by the pandemic, but we kind of learned through this work that this isn't just a study that begins and ends. It's not an academic exercise. We are a community now forever. We meet like every month and we laugh together and we cry together and we plan together. And I think everyone needs to find that person or those people through their networks to dream with, because that's the thing that keeps us going when it feels really hard.
It's so hopeful, Nicole. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And eat together. Hopefully
yes, we do. Yes. Oh, when we were in person, it was like we did miss that, but we would get on Zoom and eat together during the pandemic.
Always a must-have, right? There might be some other questions on the floor. So again, we're inviting folks, if you want to pop a question in the chat box or in the Q&A, we still have a few minutes. I'm going to build on sort of Rob's question here. I'm really curious about these design cycles that you described or you sort of gestured to. And I'm kind of, Rob was asking about how you're sort of centering youth voices in the trenches, so to speak, in the everyday on the ground life of a classroom. And I'm curious what those design cycle processes, if you could just give us a little bit of a snapshot of what sort of is entailed with that and how that comes to life and how that sort of animates the dialogue in the room.
Yeah, there's the fancy term they use in academia right now is social design-based experiment, but that's just a fancy way of saying that instead of coming in with kind of a top-down idea of a program or a study that the researcher kind of imposes upon teachers and young people, that we design together for the purpose and design with equity at the front of our mind. So we were lucky enough to have a little bit of support from the Spencer Foundation to gather in person the summer before this. We were going to launch this program. And we, again, spent like a full week. And all I came in with was, we started with not even, we all joke about this now. The teachers were like, what are we getting into? Because we didn't start with like, here's this study we're going to ask you to do. We started with an iceberg activity. So if some of you have done this iceberg activity before, it's this like team building activity where you talk about how only 10% of an iceberg is above the surface of the water, 90% is below, and comparing that to our own identities. Like, what do people not know when they look at us that is below the surface of and who we really are? And we started to immediately build community, and it kind of opened up something in all of us. And then I just had a series of questions similar to some of the questions that I shared in this talk about like, what do we dream of for our young people? And we use those questions to then start like basically batting ideas back and forth until we can kind of narrow down to essential questions. And I always talk about how teachers are pragmatic idealists. So we dream big, we need to dream big. And then we kind of deal with the constraints that we have around us and make it work. And so let's dream big about, and then we thought like, once they dreamed about like all the amazing things we could do to connect young people across time and space, then we thought, okay, but yeah, I also have this like actual curriculum that I have to do. So then we started figuring out how do we merge it all together. And I think that's so much more powerful than letting the school systems constrain our imaginations and thinking small, because that's going to stop us from ever getting to something. And we learned we could do so much more than we thought we could. So we kind of just, the same way you might design an essential question for a unit, we designed essential questions that would take us throughout the school year. They kind of built one by one upon the kind of big ideas of community, civic life, and then civic futures. And it kind of just created a nice flow that everyone could then adapt to whatever was going on in their classrooms and whatever texts they were already reading.
Those are really great. Thank you so much. We have some folks who are sharing resources in the chat and suggestions for other things to think and read with. But we do have two questions that have come through in the Q&A. So the first one is from Marlo Burks and says, thank you so much for this talk. It gets to the heart of a lot of questions about teaching I think many of us struggle with. You spoke to how words can be defanged. The word empathy is co-opted by our institutions and potentially robbed of its transformational or political power. Forgive me, I don't know how to say Sunera Tobani's suggests something similar is happening with words like diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is really difficult, a really difficult topic. How do we talk about these things with young people in a way that doesn't blunt their meaning, that goes beyond tokenism, in spite of how they might be diluted at an institutional level?
It's a great question, Marlo. And I think that the way I think about it is, number one, starting with the young people, because they will tell you where they're coming from. And again, you may find that like some people, when I used to do youth research, there's this idea that when you walk into a classroom and you tell young people that you're going to turn the reins over to them and they're going to get to direct research, you think in your head that they're all just going to like stand up and cheer and be like, finally, and like, I'm ready to go. And the reality is that that's not the case. They often are like, what? Because they've been socialized for so long within an educational system that does not value their voice, that it takes a while for them to believe that they have like the capability and the power to do that. And I think the same thing with some of these words. We might introduce a word like empathy, and you may hear students parrot back to you things that they're hearing in the media that kind of keep it at a surface level. Same thing with words like diversity, equity. Yeah, all of these words are getting kind of co-opted. And so I like to bring in, again, this gets back to the critical media literacy aspect of all this, which we could also do a whole nother talk about. But how do we show them different examples of how these terms are used in the media, start with their own experience, and use that as kind of like a gateway into a conversation about what we want these words to mean. And I think that's the kind of the spirit of inquiry that we were trying to use, guide it along. And I don't want to suggest that we are not, because I always get questions about like, how do we make sure we stay unbiased while we do this? And the answer is that we don't. This is a completely, I don't believe in political agendas in terms of Democrat, Republican. I believe in a political agenda of equity and justice, though, and that is going to influence how we talk in a classroom, what kind of resources I'm going to bring into the room. That shouldn't be a partisan issue, but sadly, we've gotten to a place where things like equity are, and I think we need to be working subversively for some of us that live in communities, which is very real, about the potential loss of jobs. But there's a stand that needs to be taken for those of us that can about not letting this idea of both sidesism take away our power. So I think that's one of the ways I would go about that.
That's really lovely. And I feel like it also set you up really nicely for our next question in terms of your response. So our next question comes from Camille, who is an alum of OISE's MA program, I believe. And they wrote, do you have recommendations on managing, I'm not sure what to call it, a balance and maybe between having dialogues and respect for different experiences with making sure oppression is not furthered by the conversations either? An example, how to help students have conversations with people who might have supported the convoy in Ottawa without giving room for someone to share Nazi ideology.
Yes, that's such a great point, because, and this gets back to a chapter of the book that I might write differently if I was doing it now, about debate. I've been thinking a lot about debate as a form of an activity that we do in classrooms, and it's often considered a best practice of civic education. And I was a debate coach, so obviously I love debate. It's been an amazing activity for young people I work with. but I get very nervous because I think we need to be very, very careful about how we structure dialogue, because like you're saying, that kind of approach of just letting, like, let me let all opinions flow in this room without a lot of prep, many different topics could get to a place where we are then giving space to views that are outside of the ideologies that we would accept in a classroom in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of safety intellectually. So I think, to me, I definitely go in a different way now, where I do not open up conversations that are debates or just an open, like, what do you think, until that unless it's about a topic where there can be, unless we've already at least set the standard first of the values that are going to guide our dialogue. So I wouldn't have a conversation about, like, convoy in Ottawa, good thing, not so good thing. Like that would not be the conversation. There could be a debate down the road about maybe how to respond as a government to it, and there could be different ways of doing that. But the idea of whether or not it's okay to say that was, like, the Nazi ideology being part of it was ever okay in the first place, that's something we would have already gone through by looking at a different form of dialogue, by looking at different pieces of media and stories, and not letting it be something that's up for debate. And I think that it seems like we're, that scares some people. But the idea is that every day in classrooms, and also in the vision and mission of our schools, there are values that are already being placed out there. So it's not like we're doing something that's, like, radical by saying that. It's that we are protecting what we say in schools that we're supposed to do, about protecting young people, having a safe and equitable environment for them. So I'm like, we could talk again for a lot longer about different forms of dialogue in the classroom, but I'm thinking about debate in a different way now.
I think that's really great. This is why we needed to bring you in person for a day rather than just this 1 hour of a public lecture. I think that this was really a lovely conversation, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself and your work and your thinking with us. I think, as Rob said in his initial comments, you are like a teacher of teachers, and we appreciate that about you so much here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap up and close this part of our conversation. We, of course, want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm especially grateful to Nicole for joining us, but also my collaborators and co-hosts, Rob Simon and Ty Walklin. Ty especially is someone who's helped to facilitate this in so many ways across the 3 conversations that we've had. So please make sure that you do him a favor and check out this really great podcast, which he dropped in the chat. But also please be sure to sign up for our newsletter listserv, that's the word I wanted, and join us again. Nicole has also shared her information in the chat if you want to follow her on Twitter, or you can find her email online as well. So for right now, we're going to close out this conversation. Please share all of your thanks in the chat, as we are unable to have you voice those to Nicole. But for folks who are joining us for our VIP session, which is a small group session where we will be discussing Nicole's work here tonight, but also the book that much of it builds from. If you're hoping to join in that maybe next year, we have to get Rob to say yes to that. We would love to have you join that newsletter, but for the folks who are joining us, take a 5-minute bio break and we'll join back in the room at maybe 7:08, 7:09 in the VIP room that we have available. But to everyone else, we hope that you have a lovely evening and a lovely rest of your week. Ty and Rob, anything else you want to add?
Just that Cassie Brownell is pretty awesome too. And we're really grateful for all of you coming to hang out with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Again.
Appreciate you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole.
Mhm.